Hey guys, tonight we are about to wander down some very old, very muddy, and frankly, quite unsettling paths. Imagine, if you will, a world lit not by the steady glow of your phone screen, or even the reliable electric hum of a street lamp, but by the flickering, sputtering dance of a tallow candle, or perhaps the orange glare of a distant bonfire. You're surrounded by shadows that seem to writhe with a life of their own, and the night air carries sounds your modern ears struggle to identify. Is that the wind an animal or something? Else, this is the backdrop against which medieval justice, in all its bizarre and brutal glory, played out. We're going to explore why punishments were so over the top, why public suffering wasn't just tolerated, but often demanded. And let's be honest, if you suddenly found yourself plonked into the 13th century, your chances of navigating their legal system and coming out unscathed are, shall we say, slim. You probably won't survive this, at least not with all your appendages intact. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It really does help the channel, and it makes me feel like I'm not just whispering into the void. You know. Oh, and drop a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see how far these little journeys reach. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're setting the stage, and it's not a particularly cheerful one, so brace yourself for a landscape of thought and existence that feels worlds away from our own. To understand why medieval punishments took such a dramatically brutal turn, you first have to immerse yourself in the everyday reality of the people who lived then. Life for most was, to put it mildly, precarious. You're not just dealing with the occasional bad harvest. You're living in a world where widespread famine was a recurring character in the story of nearly every generation. Picture fields that one year yield a meager bounty, and the next, due to drought, flood, or blight, offer nothing but dust and despair. That constant gnawing uncertainty about where your next meal, or indeed your family's next meal, might come from, creates a baseline level of stress that's hard for us, with our well-stocked supermarkets, to truly fathom. Their idea of a strategic food reserve probably involved an extra turnip and hoping for the best. Then there's disease. Oh, the glorious unchecked march of pestilence. Without an understanding of germ theory, sanitation was, shall we say, an acquired taste that few had actually acquired. Rivers were often your drinking water source and your sewage disposal system. Charming. The Black Death in the mid-14th century is, of course, the most infamous example, wiping out a staggering percentage of Europe's population. But even before and after that, waves of epidemics like smallpox, leprosy, dysentery, and influenza, which they might have called the sweating sickness, or something equally ominous, could sweep through communities with devastating speed. A simple infection from a scratch, something we'd slap a plaster on and forget could be a death sentence. A mainstream historical fact to keep in mind is that life expectancy, while varying across the centuries and social classes, hovered grimly in the 30s for many. This wasn't because people just keeled over at 35. It was heavily skewed by terrifyingly high infant and child mortality rates. Making it to adulthood was an achievement in itself. This constant proximity to death, this fragility of life, naturally shaped how people viewed the world and their place in it. When life is cheap, the mechanisms for dealing with those who disrupt the social order, or who are perceived to threaten it, tend to become proportionally harsher. If your daily existence is already a battle for survival against nature, against hunger, against unseen sickness, then the person who steals your grain or burns your barn isn't just committing a crime. They're pushing you closer to the abyss. There's less room for nuanced understanding for rehabilitation when the very fabric of your community feels perpetually on the verge of tearing. Beyond the physical hardships, you're navigating a mental landscape steeped in profound religious belief, superstition, and a palpable fear of the unknown. The world was seen as a battleground between good and evil God and the devil. Misfortunes, a failed crop, a sudden illness, a stillborn child, weren't just bad luck. They could be interpreted as divine punishment for sin, or worse, the active malice of witches, demons, or other malevolent supernatural forces. One quirky tidbit from the era is the widespread belief in something called elf shot. If you suddenly experienced a sharp, unexplained pain, or if your livestock sickened and died mysteriously, it might be attributed to invisible arrows fired by mischievous or vengeful elves or fairies. People even carried charms or performed rituals to protect themselves from such unseen assailants. It sounds whimsical to us, perhaps, but it highlights a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was incredibly porous, and where danger could lurk unseen around any corner. When you believe invisible imps might be souring your milk, it's a short step to believing your equally unpleasant neighbor might be in league with darker forces if things go wrong. Historians still argue whether the common perception of the entire medieval period, particularly the early Middle Ages, as an unremittingly dark age, is entirely accurate across all of Europe. There's evidence of significant learning artistry and legal development in various pockets. But for the average peasant, tilling their lord's land life was undeniably tough, and their understanding of the world was shaped by local custom church teachings and a good dose of fear. This fear wasn't just of bandits or invading armies, but of chaos itself, of the breakdown of social order, which in their eyes was divinely ordained. When this order was threatened, the response needed to be dramatic, decisive, and often terrifyingly public. The idea wasn't just to punish the offender, but to make an example so stark, so visceral, that others would be scared into conformity. It's a bit like those ridiculously over-the-top anti-piracy ads from the early 2000s, but with, actual dismemberment instead of just a stern warning. The very structures of society reinforced this. Feudalism, with its rigid hierarchies, meant that your life was largely determined by birth. Justice, too, was often hierarchical. The punishment for a crime could vary wildly depending on your social standing and that of your victim. An offense against a nobleman by a commoner would likely incur a far more severe penalty than the same offense committed by one nobleman against another, or a commoner against a commoner. This wasn't seen as unfair. It was part of the natural order of things, a reflection of a divinely sanctioned social structure. Challenging this structure, or the laws that upheld it, was akin to challenging God's plan, and that was a very dangerous game to play. The chilling stage for brutal punishments, therefore, wasn't just about a lack of modern sensibilities. It was a complex tapestry woven from hardship, faith, fear, and a social order that saw stark, visible retribution as essential to its very survival. Their version of a deterrent wasn't a lengthy prison sentence discussed in hushed tones. It was a body hanging in chains at the town gates, a very clear message to anyone thinking of stepping out of line. Suddenly, that overdue library book fine doesn't seem quite so intimidating, does it? So, you're living in this world we sketched out. We're just making it to next Tuesday sometimes feels like a monumental victory against the forces of nature and, well, general medieval grubbiness. That constant grinding awareness of fragility of the thin veil between a semblance of order and utter chaos doesn't just stay outside your wattle and daub hut. It seeps right into your brain, shaping how you and everyone around you think about right and wrong. It forges a particular medieval mindset, one that not only accepted, but often actively demanded harsh, public, and frankly, quite theatrical punishments. It's a worldview that can feel utterly alien to our modern sensibilities, where we tend to value individual rights and rehabilitation, at least in theory. One of the core pillars of this mindset is the overwhelming importance of the collective over the individual. You aren't just John or Jane Doe, an independent agent making your way in the world. You are part of a village, a parish, a guild, a feudal obligation. Your identity is inextricably linked to these larger groups. Personal space. That was probably just the bit of air you managed to defend with a particularly pointy stick, if you were lucky. Because of this, a crime committed by one person wasn't merely an offense against another individual, or even just against the king's peace. It was seen as an assault on the entire community, a tear in the social fabric that, if not mended dramatically, could unravel everything. It was also crucially often viewed as an offense against God. The line between sin and crime was blurry, sometimes non-existent. A theft wasn't just depriving someone of their property. It was a violation of divine commandments. Blasphemy wasn't just offensive words. It was a direct challenge to the Almighty that could bring divine wrath down upon the entire community, perhaps in the form of plague or famine, or a particularly nasty bout of whatever pestilence was doing the rounds that year. Remember that precarious existence we talked about. You can see how easily a community might link a string of bad luck to unpunished sin in their midst. This leads directly to the intense desire for order and purity. The medieval world, for all its earthiness, was obsessed with a divinely ordained cosmic order. Everything had its place, from the king on his throne down to the lowliest serf in the field, and indeed from the angels in heaven to the demons in hell. Crime and sin were disruptions of this sacred order, a kind of spiritual pollution. Therefore, punishment wasn't just about retribution or deterrence. It was a form of ritual cleansing. A public execution, a brutal flogging, or a ritual of shaming was thought to purge the community of the contamination caused by the offense. The suffering of the offender in this light became a necessary, almost sacramental act to restore balance and appease an offended God. Their idea of conflict resolution didn't involve a strongly worded email or a mediation session, that's for sure. Now you might wonder about empathy. Weren't people horrified by these spectacles of suffering? The answer is complicated. Individuals certainly felt compassion, love, and pity just as we do. But the societal expression of empathy, especially towards those branded as criminals or sinners, was filtered through this lens of collective well-being and divine order. Life was harsh, and public displays of suffering, whether from disease, accident, or judicial sentence, were common. People were to some extent desensitized. When you've seen your own children succumb to illness, or your neighbors die in agony from an infected wound, the sight of a criminal being publicly shamed or punished, while perhaps grim, might not have packed the same shocking punch it would for us. Historians still debate the extent to which the general populace genuinely endorsed these brutal spectacles, or if their participation, their jeers, their throwing of refuse, their very presence, was often coerced by social pressure, a fear of authority, or even a grim sense of duty rather than enthusiastic agreement. It's one thing to watch from the back of the crowd. It's another to be the one who has to say, "Tighten the ropes on the rack." Honor and shame were also incredibly potent forces in this mindset. In a world with limited social mobility and where your reputation was paramount, public shame could be a fate worse than death. Many punishments were explicitly designed to maximize this. Being paraded through the streets in a humiliating costume, confined in the stocks or pillory to be pelted with rotten vegetables and verbal abuse, or having your crime publicly proclaimed, these weren't just uncomfortable, they were socially devastating. Your bad day at the stocks could become the village's dinner theater for the week. Talk about a captive audience. Once your honor was stripped away so publicly, rebuilding your life and your standing in the community was an almost insurmountable task. This societal power of shame was a key tool for enforcing conformity. A mainstream historical fact that illustrates this thinking is the prevalence of mirror punishments, or lex talionis, an eye for an eye, often applied with a grim literalness or potent symbolism. A forger might have their hand branded or even removed, the hand that committed the deceit. A perjurer who swore a false oath might have their tongue pierced. A baker selling underweight loaves could be dragged through the streets on a sled with the deficient loaf tied around his neck, a very public advertisement of his crime. This wasn't just about causing pain, it was about making the punishment fit the crime in a visually immediate and understandable way, reinforcing the link between the act and its consequence for everyone to see. And then there's the ever-present belief in an afterlife, with its promise of eternal reward for the righteous and everlasting torment for the wicked. This had a peculiar effect on the perception of earthly punishment. For the truly repentant sinner, enduring brutal physical suffering on earth could be seen as a way to atone for their sins, perhaps lessening their time in purgatory, or even ensuring their eventual salvation. For the unrepentant, earthly torment was merely a grim foretaste of what awaited them in the next world. This didn't necessarily make people eager for suffering, but it framed it within a larger cosmic drama where earthly justice was just one act. A quirky, though perhaps less overtly brutal tidbit that speaks to the collective responsibility inherent in this mindset was the institution of the hue and cry. If you witnessed a serious crime like a robbery or murder, you were legally obligated to shout and raise an alarm, literally to make a hue and cry. Upon hearing this, all able-bodied men in the vicinity were required to stop whatever they were doing, grab whatever makeshift weapons they could find. Pitchforks were popular, one imagines, and join in the pursuit of the alleged culprit. If you shirked this duty, you could be fined. It was a system of community-enforced policing, a kind of medieval Amber Alert with mandatory participation. It highlights how deeply ingrained the idea was that maintaining order was everyone's job, not just that of a designated authority. This wasn't just about catching a bad guy. It was about the community actively and visibly reaffirming its own commitment to law and order. It was an immediate, visceral response to a tear in the fabric of their world, a collective surge to mend it. This mindset, this intricate web of shared belief, fear, and responsibility, is the soil in which the bizarre and brutal punishments of the era took root and for a very long time flourished. This collective mindset we've been exploring, where sin and crime were practically indistinguishable fraternal twins, and where maintaining public order felt less like a civic duty and more like a divinely sanctioned mandate, naturally led to a justice system where the lines between God's law and man's law were, shall we say, artistically blurred. You couldn't just trip over a cobblestone without someone wondering if it was a sign of your impiety. This intertwining of religious belief and secular justice is absolutely crucial to understanding why medieval punishments were often so deeply, intensely personal, and yet so publicly spectacular. It wasn't just about keeping the peace. It was about upholding a sacred cosmic balance. At the very top, you have the pervasive idea that God's law was the ultimate law. Kings and rulers throughout the medieval period, with varying degrees of persuasiveness and popular support, often leaned heavily on the concept of divine right. This meant their authority to rule, to make laws, and to enforce them wasn't just derived from military might or hereditary succession, but was granted by God Himself. Therefore, to break the king's law was not merely to defy a temporal ruler. It was, by extension, to flout the will of God. This added an extra layer of gravitas and often terror to the enforcement of laws. When the local sheriff or reeve came knocking, he wasn't just representing Lord Grumblesnort. He was, in a way, an agent of a much higher and far more intimidating authority. They took "I swear to God" very, very literally back then. No fingers crossed behind your back for these folks. The Almighty was presumed to be watching, and He definitely wasn't grading on a curve. The Church, as an institution, played a massive and complex role in this legal landscape. It wasn't just a spiritual guide, it was a major political and legal power in its own right. Ecclesiastical courts, run by bishops or their representatives, handled a wide array of cases. Naturally, these included purely religious offenses like heresy, holding beliefs contrary to official church doctrine, or blasphemy, which was speaking sacrilegiously about God or sacred things. But their jurisdiction often extended to moral offenses, such as adultery, usury, charging excessive interest, a big no-no, and even witchcraft, though the latter became a much larger obsession in later centuries. Crimes committed by clergy members also typically fell under the Church's legal purview. This brings us to a fascinating mainstream historical fact: the benefit of clergy. This was a provision in law that allowed clergymen accused of crimes to be tried in ecclesiastical courts rather than secular ones. Why was this a big deal? Well, church courts were generally more lenient. They couldn't impose the death penalty. For instance, though, they had their own array of rather unpleasant punishments, like penance fasting, pilgrimage, or imprisonment in a monastic cell, which, while not a holiday camp, was probably preferable to a secular dungeon. Over time, the benefit of clergy expanded. It wasn't just for ordained priests. It could be claimed by anyone who could prove a certain level of literacy, usually by reading a passage from the Bible. The standard test often involved reading the first verse of Psalm 51, which begins, "Miserere me Deus," "Have mercy on me, O God." This became known as the neck verse, because successfully reading it could literally save your neck from the noose. Being able to stumble through a bit of Latin was like having a get out of jail slightly less brutally card. Imagine the scene: a rough-looking character dragged before the judge accused of something nasty, and then he flawlessly recites a bit of scripture. Eyebrows would have definitely been raised. Another intriguing intersection of divine and earthly law was the concept of sanctuary. Certain churches, and sometimes entire precincts around them, were designated as places of sanctuary. If you were fleeing from the law or from someone seeking revenge, you could, in theory, claim sanctuary by reaching the church grounds, often by touching a specific part of the church, like a special door knocker or a sanctuary ring. This quirky tidbit often involved a fugitive dramatically grasping this ring, breathless and terrified with their pursuers, halting just feet away, unable to touch them without violating the sacred protection. Once inside, you were protected from arrest for a period typically around 40 days. During this time, you had a few options. Try to negotiate a pardon, agree to go into exile, abjuring the realm essentially, or face trial. If you chose exile, you'd be escorted to the nearest port, often barefoot, and carrying a wooden cross, and put on the first available ship out of the kingdom, never to return on pain of death. Claiming sanctuary was the medieval equivalent of yelling "safe" at the church door, desperately hoping the guy with the very large axe and an even larger grudge respected the invisible holy boundary. Of course, secular rulers didn't just let the church have all the fun when it came to invoking divine authority. They frequently used religious doctrine to legitimize their own power and the often brutal punishments they inflicted. Punishing criminals wasn't just about maintaining order or deterring others. It was framed as the ruler's sacred duty to cleanse the land of wickedness and uphold God's justice on earth. The public spectacle of punishment therefore served as a visible reminder not only of the king's power, but also of the divine order he represented. Oaths were another area where the divine and earthly were inextricably linked. In a society with limited written documentation for everyday transactions, a person's sworn word was incredibly important. Oaths weren't just casual promises. They were solemn vows made in the sight of God, often sworn upon holy relics, the Bible, or the consecrated altar. To break such an oath, the crime of perjury was considered an extremely serious offense, both a sin against God and a crime against society. The punishment for perjury could be severe, as it undermined the very fabric of trust upon which legal and social interactions depended. While we'll delve into the fascinating and frankly terrifying world of trial by ordeal in more detail later, it's worth noting here how it directly called upon divine intervention to determine guilt or innocence. The belief was that God would protect the innocent and reveal the guilty through these physical tests. This reliance on perceived supernatural judgment underscores just how deeply faith was embedded into the justice system. It wasn't just humans judging humans. It was an attempt to get a direct verdict from the highest authority imaginable. Historians still debate the true extent of the separation, or indeed the precise nature of cooperation between ecclesiastical and secular courts in practice. While on paper there were distinct jurisdictions and procedures, local customs, the personalities of individual bishops or lords, and shifting power dynamics often meant that the official lines were quite blurred. A powerful bishop might exert considerable influence over local secular justice, or a strong-willed king might encroach upon what the church considered its own legal territory. It wasn't a neat and tidy system. It was a constantly negotiated, sometimes contentious interplay of powers all claiming to act in the best interests of both earthly order and divine will. This messy, overlapping authority, with both church and state claiming a slice of the judging you pie, created a complex legal environment where the threat of punishment loomed large, backed by the perceived might of both earthly rulers and an all-seeing, often wrathful God. So you have these rulers and authorities from kings and queens down to powerful nobles and even city magistrates all leaning heavily on this divine mandate we talked about. They're essentially positioning themselves as God's managers here on the muddy, chaotic turf of earthly existence. But it's one thing to claim you have a heavenly endorsement. It's quite another to make sure everyone across your lands, especially when those lands are vast roads, are terrible, and your fastest mode of mass communication is basically a man on a horse who might get sidetracked by a good alehouse or, eaten by wolves, actually gets the message and behaves accordingly. How do you project your authority, your absolute power, in a way that's unmistakable, unforgettable, and reaches even the most remote turnip farming corner of your realm? Well, for medieval rulers, one of the most effective, if chilling, methods was the brutal public display of punishment. This wasn't just about justice for a specific crime. It was a carefully orchestrated performance of power. Imagine you're a peasant or a humble artisan living in a world where the forces of nature are overwhelming, life is fragile. Remember those dodgy survival rates, and the local lord or the distant king seems like an almost mythical figure. Then news arrives, or perhaps you even witness it yourself. Someone who defied that authority, someone who broke one of those divinely backed laws, is subjected to a terrifyingly inventive and public form of suffering. The message seared into your mind is crystal clear. This is what happens when you cross the people in charge. Their public service announcements were a bit more direct than ours. No catchy jingles or animated PSAs, just, a very graphic and personal demonstration of consequences. The sheer brutality of many medieval punishments was in large part a calculated strategy of deterrence through terror. The aim was to make the consequences of rebellion, treason, theft, or even lesser social transgressions so horrifying that the mere thought of committing such an act would make your knees tremble. If a king wanted to show he was really in charge, he didn't just issue a strongly worded proclamation that might get read out, if you were lucky, by a semi-literate cleric in the market square. No, he'd arrange for a very public, very pointy reminder of his reach and his wrath. This theatrical violence served to embody the abstract power of the state, making it tangible and terrifyingly real. You see, power needs to be legible. People need to be able to read it. In an era with low literacy rates, the body of the condemned often became the parchment upon which the law wrote its most fearsome decrees. Punishments were frequently symbolic, designed to mirror the crime or to make a statement about the nature of the authority that had been violated. Traitors, for example, those who committed crimes against the sovereign or the state, often faced the most elaborate and gruesome ends. The infamous punishment of being hanged, drawn and quartered, reserved for high treason in England, was a multi-stage horror show. The victim was dragged to the place of execution, drawn, hanged, but cut down while still alive, disemboweled, and their entrails burned before their eyes, and then finally beheaded, and their body cut into 4 pieces, quartered. These parts might then be displayed in prominent public places. We're keeping it PG-13, so you'll have to use your imagination for the grislier bits. But the intent was clear. Each stage symbolized the totality of the state's power to undo a person, to obliterate them both physically and symbolically for daring to challenge the sovereign. It was the ultimate terrible assertion that the ruler held the power of life and, more importantly, the manner of death. These displays, also served to reaffirm the rigid social hierarchy we touched upon earlier. The severity and type of punishment often depended heavily on your social standing and that of your victim. An insult to a peasant might result in a fine or a few hours in the stocks. A similar insult to a nobleman could cost you your hand or your life. Offenses against the king or his immediate representatives naturally drew the most spectacular and inventive forms of retribution. This wasn't about equality before the law. It was about reinforcing the existing order, demonstrating that everyone had their place, and that the ruler at the apex of this pyramid was to be obeyed without question. Particularly in times of political instability, peasant revolts, or challenges to the throne, exemplary punishments became a crucial tool for suppressing dissent. When a ruler's grip on power felt a bit shaky, a swift and brutal crackdown on any perceived troublemakers could send a powerful shockwave of fear through the population, discouraging others from joining the opposition. Historians still debate whether these overwhelmingly brutal displays of power primarily fostered genuine obedience and loyalty out of fear, or if they also bred deep-seated resentment and a simmering desire for rebellion amongst the populace, just waiting for an opportunity to erupt. It's a classic fear versus respect leadership dilemma, just played out with significantly more chains and sharp objects. One common and very visible mainstream historical fact related to this display of power was the use of gibbets. After an execution, especially for notorious criminals like pirates, highwaymen, or rebels, the body wouldn't always be quietly buried. Instead, it might be coated in tar as a preservative grimly enough, and then suspended in a specially constructed iron cage, the gibbet, and left to hang at a prominent public location, perhaps at a major crossroads near the town gates, or at the scene of their crime. There, you would be trundling along with your cart, and you'd see this decaying silhouette against the skyline, a constant rotting reminder of the king's justice and the fate of those who defied it. It was long-term advertising for the consequences of crime, and it didn't require a budget for reruns. Now for a quirky tidbit about the instruments of this power, the executioner. This was the individual tasked with carrying out these brutal sentences from floggings and brandings to the final act on the scaffold. You might think such an important state functionary would be respected, but often the opposite was true. Executioners frequently lived on the margins of society, shunned and feared by the very populace who might flock to watch them work. Their trade was considered unclean, and they often had to live in designated areas, sometimes outside the city walls. Paradoxically, because of their grim work, some executioners gained a fairly extensive, if practical, knowledge of human anatomy. This sometimes led to them acting as informal surgeons or bone setters, as respectable medical practitioners might be hesitant to deal with the kinds of injuries they were familiar with. The executioner, the one guy whose job invitation you really hoped got lost in the medieval mail, yet a figure absolutely essential for the state's performance of its ultimate authority. Their very existence was a testament to the ruler's power over life and limb, a walking, talking, though probably not very popular at parties, symbol of the sovereign's might. So the powers that be, from the grandest king to the local magistrate with a particularly pointy hat, are staging these rather grim productions, these vivid and visceral demonstrations of what happens if you dare to color outside the strictly defined lines of medieval society. We've seen how it was a display of raw authority, a way to hammer home the message of who's in charge, especially when your Wi-Fi password is carrier pigeon. But for any spectacle to truly land to have its intended impact, you absolutely need an audience, don't you? And oh my, did these events draw a crowd. You're about to step into the throng to understand why public torment and execution became this truly bizarre blend of solemn warning and uncomfortable as it is to consider a form of grim entertainment. It's this dual nature that's so fascinating and to our modern sensibilities so profoundly unsettling. On one hand, yes, these were absolutely meant as deterrents. You, as a spectator, were supposed to watch the agony of the condemned, hear their cries, witness the ultimate irreversible consequence of their actions, and think to yourself, write note to self, do not engage in treasonous shenanigans or pilfer Lord Grumblesnort's prize-winning pig. The fear was a key ingredient. But if it were only about fear and sober reflection, you might expect a more somber, sparsely attended affair. Instead, public punishments, especially executions, often took on a strangely carnivalesque atmosphere. Forget Netflix medieval binge-watching sometimes involved finding a good vantage point near the gallows or the pillory, and maybe hoping for a particularly dramatic showing. Imagine the scene, it's execution day. For many, particularly those whose lives revolved around grueling agricultural labor or monotonous craft work, remember that daily grind we talked about in Section 1. This was a significant break from routine. It was a public event, a gathering. You'd often find food and drink vendors setting up stalls, selling pies ale or roasted nuts. Minstrels might even be playing, at least until things got too serious. The air wouldn't just be thick with anticipation, but with the smell of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, and perhaps some slightly questionable medieval street food. It was a day out, a chance to see people, to catch up on gossip, and yes, to witness something dramatic and out of the ordinary. Their idea of a blockbuster event had a much more literal and often much sharper interpretation of block. These spectacles also functioned as a kind of moral theater. The proceedings were often highly ritualized. The condemned person might be paraded through the streets, sometimes forced to wear signs detailing their crimes, or carry an object symbolizing their misdeeds, like that baker with the underweight loaf around his neck we mentioned. Upon reaching the scaffold or the place of punishment, there would often be prayers, a sermon from a priest, exhorting the crowd to live righteous lives, and crucially, the last dying speech of the condemned. This was a pivotal moment. A prisoner who confessed their guilt, expressed remorse, and asked for forgiveness from God, and the community might elicit some measure of sympathy, or at least a sense of grim satisfaction that justice was being served and a soul was perhaps making its peace. Their words would be repeated, discussed, and often amplified. Conversely, a defiant prisoner might be met with jeers and further condemnation from the crowd. The audience wasn't passive. They were participants in this public drama, their reactions reinforcing the moral lessons being enacted. The emotional landscape of this is complex. For a society living with constant low-level anxiety, fear of famine, disease, war, and the ever-present threat of damnation, did these highly charged public events offer some form of collective emotional release, a kind of societal catharsis, however dark? Seeing a perceived wrongdoer meet a dramatic end could for some reaffirm a sense of order in a chaotic world. It could channel diffuse anxieties and angers onto a single visible target. This isn't to say everyone was gleefully bloodthirsty, but the psychological dynamics of large crowds witnessing intense events are rarely simple. And of course, there's the factor of desensitization. As we've touched upon, death and suffering were far more visible in medieval life than they are for most of us today. You would likely have witnessed deaths in your own family, seen animals slaughtered, and been aware of the constant presence of disease and injury. This doesn't mean people felt nothing but their threshold for what constituted a shocking or unbearable sight was likely different from ours. The regularity of public justice, even in its milder forms, like the stocks, made it a familiar, if unpleasant part of the social scenery. One very popular form of media that grew out of these events, a mainstream historical fact for you, was the execution ballad, or gallows literature. These were pamphlets, broadsides, or songs often hastily printed and sold to the crowd on the day of an execution. They would detail the lurid crimes of the condemned, their supposed confessions, their last words, and perhaps a moralizing verse or two, warning others to avoid a similar fate. This was, in essence, the birth of true crime as popular entertainment. People bought these, read them, sang them. It was a way to process the event, to spread the story, and for the printers and ballad mongers, a tidy little business opportunity. Get your commemorative crime confession here, fresh off the press and suitably mournful. For a quirky and rather unsettling tidbit, consider the belief that lingered in some places for centuries, the hanged man's hand. It was a folk superstition that touching the hand, or sometimes other body parts, of a recently executed criminal, particularly one who had been hanged, could cure various ailments. Afflictions like warts, goiters, tumors, or scrofula. A type of glandular swelling also known as the king's evil, which was ironically also thought to be curable by the touch of a monarch, were sometimes treated by this macabre remedy. You can imagine the scene as soon as the body was cut down, or even while it was still hanging. People might surge forward desperate to touch the corpse in the hope of a cure. It's a stark illustration of the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards death justice and the bodies of the condemned, simultaneously objects of fear, revulsion, moral instruction, and bizarrely magical healing. Naturally, with such a complex phenomenon, historians still debate the primary motivation of the crowds attending these public punishments. Was it largely morbid curiosity, a macabre fascination with the forbidden and the grotesque? Was it a genuine, if grim, desire to see justice done and societal norms upheld? Did religious piety play a significant role with people attending to pray for the condemned soul, or to reflect on their own mortality? How much was simple social pressure? If everyone else in the village was going, you might feel compelled to as well. Or was it, for many, simply the lure of a spectacle, a day out from the relentless toil of medieval life, with a frisson of danger and high drama thrown in? The truth is likely a muddled combination of all these things, varying from person to person, and from one event to the next. If you complained about a bad view at an execution, there wasn't exactly a customer service hotline you could call. You just got jostled by someone else possibly holding a rotten cabbage with your name on it. Now, all this public drama, this theater of justice and suffering we've been wading through with its execution ballads and its rather questionable folk cures, wasn't just for show, or even just for moral instruction as grim entertainment. It was all intimately tied to a very practical problem, a gaping hole in the fabric of medieval society, the almost complete absence of what you or I would recognize as a dedicated professional police force. There were no bobbies, on the beat, as they'd later be called in London, no detectives in trench coats meticulously gathering fingerprints, mainly because fingerprinting hadn't been invented and trench coats would have been terribly impractical for chasing a pig thief through a muddy field. This lack of organized policing profoundly influenced the very nature of medieval justice and why it often had to be so immediate, so public, and so reliant on community participation. Imagine your medieval town or village. There's no emergency number to call. Their equivalent wasn't 999 or 911. It was basically just yelling really, really loudly and hoping your neighbors weren't too engrossed in their turnip harvest or too busy arguing about who had the pointiest hat. If a crime occurred, say your prize-winning goat, Bartholomew, has vanished overnight, or you hear a scuffle down the lane, there wasn't a central dispatch sending out uniformed officers. Instead, responsibility for maintaining order and apprehending wrongdoers fell largely upon the community itself, and a smattering of local officials who were often more administrators than investigators. We've touched on the hue and cry before that legal obligation for everyone to drop what they were doing and join the chase if an alarm was raised. This wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a cornerstone of law enforcement in many parts of medieval Europe. In England, for instance, systems like frank pledge existed particularly in the earlier medieval period. This was a system where communities were divided into groups, typically of 10 households, and all the men in that group were mutually responsible for each other's conduct. If one member of the tithing, as it was called, committed a crime and fled, the others could be fined if they didn't bring him to justice. It was like a mandatory group project for staying out of trouble. And if one person in your group decided to say abscond with the church collection plate, everyone else was suddenly on the hook. Talk about peer pressure. Then you had the watch and ward. In towns and cities, citizens were often required to take turns serving as night watchmen. Their job was to patrol the streets after dark, look out for fires, a constant and terrifying hazard. In tightly packed wooden towns, apprehend suspicious characters, and generally keep the peace. Sounds reasonable, right? Except these watchmen were often unpaid or very poorly paid. The duty might fall to householders in rotation, many of whom were understandably less than enthusiastic about giving up a night's sleep to stumble around in the dark, especially if it was cold and raining. The medieval neighborhood watch was less about polite coordinating emails and more about, "All right, it's your turn, Giles. Try not to fall asleep in the pigsty again. And here's a rusty halberd. Good luck." As for officials, you had figures like the reeve in a village, who was often a peasant, elected or appointed to oversee the lord's interests and keep order. In larger districts, there was the sheriff, the shire reeve, a royal official with a range of responsibilities, including collecting taxes, executing writs, and yes, apprehending serious criminals. Then there were constables and bailiffs. But these individuals rarely had a dedicated force under them. They relied heavily on the posse comitatus, literally the power of the county, which was essentially the mobilized citizenry, the hue and cry, on a slightly more organized scale. A mainstream historical fact that formalizes this is the Assize of Arms issued in England by Henry II in 1181. This decree required all freemen of the realm to possess certain types of arms and armor according to their wealth, and to be ready to use them in the king's service, which included pursuing criminals. It wasn't just about national defense. It was about internal security too, making every able-bodied freeman a potential if reluctant crime fighter. Now, because catching criminals was so difficult and often dependent on the immediate reaction of the community or the diligence of these part-time enforcers, the nature of punishment itself was shaped accordingly. If your chances of actually nabbing a culprit were, shall we say, variable, Then when you did catch someone, the punishment needed to be particularly memorable. There was a strong emphasis on deterrence. You made an example of the offenders you caught, hoping the sheer brutality or public shame of their fate would scare anyone else from trying something similar. Long-term imprisonment, as a primary form of punishment, wasn't really a thing yet. We'll get to the grim reality of medieval dungeons later, but they were mostly for holding people before trial or execution, not as a sentence in themselves. So punishments tended to be swift, corporal inflicting, physical pain, shaming, or capital. Quick, visible, and hopefully effective in scaring the wits out of potential miscreants. Of course, when official channels for justice were perceived as slow, ineffective, or biased, which they often could be, especially if you were up against someone rich or powerful, people might resort to private justice. This could mean personal retaliation, or on a larger scale, blood feuds between families or factions, which could simmer and erupt for generations. We'll touch more on that when we get to fines and weregild. A rather quirky and often amusing tidbit from the time revolves around the general competence, or lack thereof, of these watchmen and local constables. They were frequent targets of satire and jokes, even in their own era. Literary figures like Shakespeare's Dogberry and Verges in Much Ado About Nothing perfectly encapsulate this stereotype of the bumbling, self-important, and largely ineffective local official. Contemporary accounts and court records sometimes paint a picture of watchmen who were more likely to be found sleeping on duty, easily bribed, or simply too old or infirm to effectively chase down a nimble thief. The town watchman, often the first to arrive at the scene of a really good nap he'd just been having. It makes you appreciate that organized police forces, for all their flaws, are probably a step up from relying on a sleepy guy named Cuthbert and his half-hearted waving of a stick. Historians still debate how effective these early decentralized systems of law enforcement actually were in maintaining day-to-day order across the diverse landscapes of medieval Europe. Was it the formal structures like the hue and cry and the sheriff's efforts that kept a lid on things, or did communities rely more heavily on informal social controls? The fear of God, the pressure of community opinion, the threat of immediate reprisal from your neighbors, and the bonds of kinship. It was likely a complex mix, with the effectiveness varying wildly depending on the specific time, place, and the current level of local drama, involving missing livestock or particularly potent ale. The big problems, stemming from no bobbies, meant that justice had to be loud, visible, and often painfully unforgettable. So you find yourself in this somewhat haphazard medieval justice system, where, as we've seen, there's no dedicated police force meticulously collecting clues with little tweezers and putting them in evidence baggies. Catching a suspect is one challenge, but then proving their guilt, especially when eyewitness accounts are contradictory or non-existent, presents a whole other layer of difficulty. What do you do when human testimony is unreliable? Circumstantial evidence is thin on the ground, and you desperately need a verdict that the community steeped in its belief in divine oversight. Remember that from Section 3 will accept as legitimate. Well, for a significant chunk of the medieval period, the answer was to essentially outsource the final judgment call to God Himself through the peculiar and often perilous practice of trial by ordeal. You're about to witness how, when earthly methods failed, they turned to the divine to sort the innocent from the guilty, often in ways that tested faith and flesh in equal measure. Their legal system's approach to beyond a reasonable doubt sometimes involved beyond a reasonable degree of scalding. The underlying logic, if you can call it that from our modern perspective, was relatively straightforward, at least in theory. It was believed that an omniscient and just God would not allow an innocent person to suffer unjustly, nor would he permit a guilty person to escape their due. Therefore, if an accused person underwent a prescribed physical test, a trial by ordeal, God would intervene either by protecting the innocent from harm or by ensuring the guilty party's injury clearly marked their culpability. These weren't just random acts of endurance. They were solemn, highly ritualized affairs, usually overseen by the clergy, which lent them an air of sacred authority. The accused would often have to fast, pray, and attend Mass before undergoing the ordeal, emphasizing the religious nature of the proceeding. You were, in essence, putting your fate directly into God's hands, or at least that was the prevailing idea. Several types of ordeals became common across Europe, each with its own charming set of risks. One of the most well-known was the ordeal of hot iron. Here, you, the accused, might be required to carry a red-hot piece of iron, weighing perhaps 1 to 3 pounds, for a set number of paces, usually 9. After this rather uncomfortable stroll, your hand would be bound and sealed by a priest. Then came the waiting game. After 3 days, the bandage would be ceremoniously removed. If your hand was found to be healing cleanly, without festering or excessive inflammation, then congratulations, God had clearly shown your innocence. If, however, it was a suppurating, angry mess, well, that was divine proof of your guilt, and you could expect the subsequent secular punishment to follow swiftly. You can imagine the anxiety of those 3 days, every throb and twinge in your bandaged hand, feeling like a divine judgment in progress. Then, there was the ordeal of hot water. Similar in principle, this involved you plunging your arm, sometimes up to the elbow, into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone or a ring. Again, your scalded limb would be bound, and the state of its healing after 3 days would determine your fate. It's a system that doesn't leave much room for a maybe. Perhaps the most dramatically counterintuitive from our point of view was the ordeal of cold water. In this scenario, you would be bound often thumb to opposite toe to restrict movement and then lowered into a body of water, a river or a specially consecrated pool. Now here's the tricky part. If you sank, you are generally considered innocent. The pure water, blessed by a priest, was thought to have accepted you. Of course, the trick was to pull you out before you actually drowned, which one hopes they were reasonably good at. If, however, you floated, this was often taken as a sign of guilt. The reasoning was that the sanctified water was rejecting you, the sinner. The ordeal of cold water. If you float, you're guilty. If you sink and drown, congratulations, you were innocent. Small comfort, perhaps, but hey, your name is cleared. For those of a clerical persuasion, or sometimes for less serious accusations, there was the ordeal of the morsel, also known as the korsned, or cursed bread. You would be given a piece of consecrated bread, or sometimes cheese, to eat after swearing an oath of innocence. If you could swallow it without choking, gagging, or appearing unduly distressed, you were innocent. If you choked or couldn't get it down, it was seen as God physically preventing a liar from consuming the sacred host. Imagine your entire future hinging on whether you can eat a dry medieval cracker without coughing under immense pressure. Suddenly, that important presentation at work doesn't seem quite so nerve-wracking, does it? A particularly eerie, and quirky tidbit is the ordeal of the beer. This was sometimes used in murder cases where the killer was unknown, but perhaps suspected. The alleged murderer would be compelled to approach or touch the corpse of the victim. If the victim's wounds were believed to bleed afresh, or if the body showed some other sign like foaming at the mouth or moving slightly, this was taken as a miraculous accusation from beyond the grave, a divine sign pointing directly to the guilty party. You can picture the intense, hushed atmosphere, the flickering torchlight on the pale face of the deceased, and the suspect trembling, forced to confront the silent accuser. It's important to remember that these ordeals weren't typically the first resort. They were often used when other forms of evidence, such as eyewitness testimony or sufficient oath helpers, people willing to swear to your good character, were lacking or inconclusive. They were a way to resolve judicial deadlocks. However, their use began to wane significantly, and a key mainstream historical fact here is the pivotal role of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This influential church council, convened by Pope Innocent III, effectively forbade clergy from participating in or blessing trials by ordeal. Without the church's official sanction and involvement, the ordeals lost much of their perceived legitimacy as instruments of divine judgment. Deprived of their priestly administrators, secular courts across Europe gradually abandoned them, which in turn spurred the development and wider adoption of other methods of determining guilt, most notably the trial by jury, which had already been emerging in some areas. Even during their heyday, historians still debate whether ordeals were genuinely believed to be foolproof methods of divine judgment by all participants, or if there was an element of psychological manipulation, social pressure, or even subtle rigging involved in their administration. Did the priest perhaps apply the bandage a little looser for someone he believed innocent, or use slightly cooler water? Was the healing of a burned subject to interpretation based on the accused's social standing or the mood of the community? It's hard to say for sure, but the very existence of these practices speaks volumes about a world where the veil between the natural and supernatural was incredibly thin, and where divine intervention in human affairs was not just a possibility, but an expectation, especially when it came to the grave matter of justice. So with the church increasingly side-eyeing those rather dramatic God will sort 'em out ordeals, and eventually, after that pivotal Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, formally discouraging its priests from officiating them, medieval communities and their secular authorities found themselves needing to rely more heavily on other methods to determine guilt and, crucially, to enforce societal norms. While physical punishments, as we'll undoubtedly explore, further, certainly didn't go out of fashion, far from it. There was another incredibly potent weapon in their arsenal, one that aimed less at the body and more at your very sense of self, your standing in the community. This weapon was public shame, and its sting could be devastatingly long-lasting, leaving scars that, while invisible, could cripple your life, perhaps even more effectively than a flogging. Remember how we talked about the medieval mindset, where your honor, your reputation, your good name within your tight-knit village or town was practically currency, if not maybe rewind to Section 2 after you've drifted off tonight. In a world without LinkedIn profiles, or the ability to just pack up and reinvent yourself in a new city 1,000 miles away, what people thought of you, whispered about you at the market, or proclaimed about you in the public square mattered immensely. Lose that, and you lost almost everything: your ability to trade, to find a marriage partner, to be trusted, to simply belong. and medieval society, recognizing this, devised a whole host of punishments designed specifically to humiliate, to ostracize, and to make you a walking billboard of your own transgressions. Their version of cancel culture often involved significantly more direct public participation and a distinct lack of Wi-Fi. One of the most straightforward methods was forcing a public confession or apology. You might be made to stand before the church congregation on a Sunday or in the busiest part of the marketplace and loudly announce your crime, express your remorse, whether you felt it or not, and beg for forgiveness from God and your community. Imagine the burning ears, the downcast eyes, the feeling of every gaze boring into you, dissecting your every stammered word. This wasn't just about saying sorry. It was a ritual of abasement designed to strip away your pride and reassert the community's moral standards. Then there were the more elaborate rituals of degradation, the parades of shame. You might be forced to ride through the streets, perhaps seated backward on a donkey, a traditional symbol of foolishness and ignominy, while the populace jeered and perhaps threw less than fresh produce your way. Sometimes you'd have to wear objects symbolic of your crime. A dishonest baker might carry his short-weight loaves, a drunkard an empty tankard, or an eavesdropper might wear oversized ears made of cloth. The point was to make your shame visible, undeniable, and a source of public mockery. If you thought a bad online review was damaging to a business, imagine having to personally parade your one-star behavior, quite literally, for everyone to see and ridicule. This is where devices like the stocks and pillory come into play. And while we'll likely encounter them again, when we discuss more common everyday cruelties, their primary function was often rooted in this culture of shame. Being locked by your ankles in the stocks, or by your head and hands in the pillory, left you utterly exposed and vulnerable in a public place for hours, sometimes days. You were a captive audience for the community's scorn, a target for anything from verbal abuse to rotten eggs mud, or even less savory projectiles. The physical discomfort was certainly part of it, but the deep humiliation, the sheer helplessness of that public exposure was the core of the punishment. For women in particular, a common shaming device was the cucking stool, or, as it evolved, the ducking stool. This was a chair, sometimes an armchair fixed to a long pole or beam, often on wheels, so it could be paraded through the town first. If you were accused of being a common scold, a woman deemed too argumentative, gossipy, or generally disruptive to the patriarchal order, or sometimes for other offenses like bearing an illegitimate child or being a difficult wife, you could find yourself strapped into this chair. Then you'd be wheeled to the nearest pond or river and repeatedly dunked into the cold, murky water, much to the amusement of the assembled crowd. While the shock of the cold water and the near-drowning experience were undoubtedly unpleasant, the primary aim was profound public humiliation, a harsh lesson in conformity. A mainstream historical fact related to silencing and shaming women is the branks, sometimes called the scold's bridle. This was a truly unpleasant contraption, an iron framework like a cage that was placed over a woman's head. It had a metal plate or gag, often sharpened or covered with spikes, that was inserted into her mouth to press down on her tongue, making speech impossible or very painful. If you were accused of nagging, gossiping, blaspheming, or just generally speaking out of turn, you might be forced to wear this device sometimes, while also being led through the streets or tied to a public post. talk about a device to ensure you really thought before you spoke, or more likely, to ensure you just didn't speak at all. It was a brutal and very direct way of enforcing silence and obedience. Beyond officially sanctioned punishments, communities themselves often took shaming into their own hands with a quirky and fascinating practice known as charivari, or in England sometimes a skimmington ride, or rough music. This was a noisy, deliberately chaotic, and often intimidating folk ritual, directed at individuals whose behavior violated community norms, especially in domestic or sexual matters. Perhaps a husband was known to be henpecked by his wife, or an older man married a much younger woman, or there was a case of adultery, or a spouse was notoriously abusive. The community often, young men would gather at night outside the offender's house, banging pots and pans, blowing horns, shouting obscenities, and sometimes parading effigies of the couple in compromising or ridiculous positions. While not strictly a legal punishment, authorities often turned a blind eye, or even tacitly approved, as it served as a powerful, if unruly, form of social control and public shaming. It was grassroots justice, loud, intrusive, and deeply humiliating for its targets. The goal of all these shaming rituals wasn't just a fleeting moment of embarrassment. It was to inflict a lasting sting, to damage your reputation so severely that you'd find it difficult to function normally within the community. Historians still debate whether these shaming punishments were more effective in genuinely reforming behavior through induced remorse and a desire for reintegration, or if they primarily entrenched social divisions, confirmed an individual's outsider status, and led to further marginalization rather than genuine reconciliation. Did being publicly branded a scold or a cheat make you change your ways? Or did it just make it impossible for you to escape that label, driving you further into whatever behavior got you into trouble in the first place? It's a complex question, but there's no doubt that in a world built on personal reputation and communal interdependence, the fear of public disgrace was a powerful force shaping behavior and reinforcing the often unforgiving social codes of the medieval world. So you've potentially endured the icy grip of public shame, your reputation perhaps dragged through the metaphorical and sometimes literal mud of the marketplace, your every social interaction now colored by the transgression you were accused of. But what if your alleged crime was deemed too severe for mere humiliation? Or what if the authorities, in their wisdom or their wrath, decided that a more visceral and even more unforgettable message needed to be sent? This is where your physical body itself often became the unwilling canvas upon which the brutal and frequently bloody art of medieval justice was painted. You're about to understand the prevailing belief that physical suffering wasn't just a byproduct of punishment, but an essential ingredient for atonement, for deterrence, and for making the law's power terrifyingly visible. This idea that the body must suffer for the soul's potential salvation or for societal order to be restored has deep roots. We've touched on the medieval mindset where sin and crime were closely linked, and where a disruption in the earthly order was also seen as an offense against the divine. In this framework, physical pain could be viewed paradoxically as a form of purification. Just as devout ascetics might mortify their own flesh through fasting or self-flagellation to achieve spiritual clarity, or atone for sins, the suffering inflicted by judicial punishment could be framed as a penance. Your body endured the agony, and through that agony, perhaps your soul found a path to redemption. or at least society perceived that a debt was being paid in a currency everyone understood pain. When they said justice was disfiguringly expensive, they sometimes meant it quite literally for the person on the receiving end. Beyond the spiritual dimension, the deterrent effect of visible physical suffering was undeniable. Remember, this is a world without widespread literacy or mass media, as discussed in relation to the display of power in Section 4. A carefully worded statute or a proclaimed law might be forgotten or misunderstood by many. But the sight of a thief with a missing hand, a blasphemer with a mutilated tongue, or the raw bleeding back of someone freshly flogged, these were messages that needed no translation. They spoke a universal language of cause and effect, a brutal but effective lesson for anyone contemplating a similar misdeed. Your punished body became a walking breathing, though perhaps painfully so, advertisement for the consequences of breaking the law. This brings us back to a concept we briefly encountered earlier, the principle of lex talionis, or an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. While not always applied with surgical precision, the idea of making the punishment mirror the crime was a recurring theme, especially when it came to mutilation. The hand that stole might be struck off. The tongue that swore a false oath or uttered blasphemy might be pierced or removed. The eyes that looked upon forbidden things, or the feet that carried one into criminal enterprise, might be targeted. The body, in this sense, became a literal text, graphically illustrating the nature of the offense for all to see and comprehend. It was a gruesome form of poetic justice designed to make the crime and its consequence inseparable. Branding was a common form of this bodily inscription. You, as the convicted, would be restrained while a red-hot iron, often shaped into a letter or symbol representing your crime, was pressed into your flesh, perhaps on the cheek, forehead, shoulder, or hand. The searing pain would be intense, and the resulting scar would be a permanent mark of your disgrace. In England, for example, a mainstream historical fact is the use of specific letters: T for thief, V for vagrant, R for rogue, F for forger, or even SL for a seditious libeler. This brand wasn't just a punishment. It was a lifelong label, instantly communicating your past to anyone you met. Their idea of a permanent record was literally seared onto your skin. Try explaining that at your next hypothetical job interview in the 14th century. Maiming went a step further, involving the removal or disabling of body parts. Hands were amputated for theft or assault. Ears might be cropped for lesser offenses, or for perjury, as if to say you were no longer fit to hear honest testimony. Noses were sometimes slit, or cut off, a particularly disfiguring punishment, often associated with sexual offenses or acts that brought profound dishonor. Blinding was another horrific, yet not uncommon form of mutilation, effectively ending a person's ability to function independently in many spheres of life. These weren't just acts of cruelty. They were calculated to permanently diminish the offender, both physically and socially, marking them as an outcast and serving as a constant living warning to others. Flogging or whipping was perhaps one of the most widespread forms of corporal punishment, applied for a vast range of offenses, from petty theft and public drunkenness to more serious crimes, or as a component of a larger punishment. You'd be stripped, often to the waist, tied to a post or a cart, and then lashed a set number of times with a whip rod or cat-o'-nine tails. The pain would be excruciating, the skin broken and bleeding. This was often a very public affair, the procession to the whipping post and the punishment itself, drawing crowds, transforming your personal agony into a communal spectacle of retribution and deterrence. The social consequences of surviving such mutilations were dire. How did you earn a living if you were missing a hand essential for your craft? How did you find acceptance if your face was permanently branded with the mark of a thief? Often, you were pushed to the very fringes of society, forced into begging, or relying on the charity of the church. Your disfigurement, a constant reminder of your past, and a barrier to any semblance of a normal life. You thought getting a bad tattoo after a regrettable night out was a lifelong commitment. Imagine one chosen for you by a slightly miffed medieval magistrate and applied with a glowing piece of metal. A quirky, yet strategically brutal tidbit is the practice of symbolic blinding, particularly for political rivals or deposed rulers, a practice seen in various cultures, including the Byzantine Empire. Instead of outright execution, which could create martyrs or incite further rebellion, blinding served a specific political purpose. It rendered the individual unwhole and therefore unfit to rule as a leader, was often expected to be physically capable of leading armies and embodying sovereign authority. It was a way to neutralize a threat, while sometimes maintaining a veneer of mercy by sparing their life. It's a chilling example of how physical suffering could be calibrated for very specific political ends, where the body becomes a pawn in games of power. Naturally, the application of these punishments wasn't always uniform. Historians still debate the extent to which the choice of specific mutilations was consistently and meticulously symbolic, truly reflecting the lex talionis in every case, or if it was often more arbitrary. Was it driven by the perceived severity of the offense, the social status of the offender and victim, the whim of the local lord or magistrate, or established regional customs, rather than a strict symbolic code? The answer likely varies across time and place, but the underlying principle remained: your body was not entirely your own when you transgressed the law. It could be marked broken and displayed a testament to the belief that physical suffering was a necessary and indeed righteous component of justice. So your body has potentially been marked by the hot iron. Perhaps you're short a finger or two, or you've at least endured a thorough lashing, all serving as that rather gruesome living billboard for the king's justice and the consequences of stepping too far out of line. But not every offense, not every little social hiccup or minor act of roguery resulted in such drastic and frequently permanent alterations to your person. For the more everyday infractions, the commoner garden variety of medieval misbehavior, the kind of thing that might get you a stern talking to or a fine today, there was a whole different toolkit of punishments. These were still deeply unpleasant, mind you, often combining physical discomfort with a hefty dose of public humiliation. A theme we keep returning to because it was just that important, but they were generally not designed to be immediately life-threatening. Though accidents or particularly hostile crowds could certainly change that equation. Let's gently lift the veil on some of these common cruelties, the kind of street furniture of justice you might have encountered in any medieval town. Probably the most iconic of these are the stocks and the pillory. You've seen them in illustrations, perhaps even in cheesy historical reenactments. The stocks were typically a wooden framework with holes for your ankles and sometimes also for your wrists. You'd be forced to sit often on the cold, damp ground or a low, uncomfortable bench with your legs trapped. This might not sound too terrible for a few minutes, but imagine being stuck in that cramped, unnatural position for hours, sometimes even for days, exposed to the elements. the biting wind, the rain, the hot sun, and of course you were exposed to the public. Your friends, your enemies, your neighbors, complete strangers, all could pass by stare jeer, and if they were so inclined, throw things. Rotten fruit, mud animal dung, spoiled fish. Whatever was unpleasant and at hand. Their idea of time out for misbehaving involved less quiet self-reflection and more public exposure to a rather unappetizing barrage of airborne vegetables. Offenses that might land you in the stocks were usually on the lower end of the criminal scale: public drunkenness, minor theft, vagrancy, swearing, or perhaps a bit of disorderly conduct after one too many ales at the local tavern. The pillory was a step up in discomfort and often in seriousness. This was also a wooden framework, but it secured your head and hands, forcing you to stand often on a raised platform to ensure maximum visibility. Your neck and wrists would be clamped, your head often thrust forward in a deeply awkward and humiliating posture. Being unable to move your head made you a much easier target for anything the crowd decided to hurl your way, and being forced to stand for hours on end was exhausting and painful in itself. The pillory was often located in the most prominent public place, like the market square, ensuring the largest possible audience for your suffering. While the stocks were generally for minor offenses, the pillory could be used for more serious misdemeanors, like perjury fraud, a dishonest baker selling underweight loaves, or a miller cheating on measures might find himself here liable, or even as a precursor to more severe punishments. The pillory guaranteed to give you a stiff neck and a really, really bad day, especially if overripe tomatoes were in season. A famous mainstream historical fact is that Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe and Moll Flanders, was sentenced to the pillory 3 times in 1703 for publishing a satirical pamphlet titled The Shortest Way with the Dissenters. However, in a fascinating twist, public opinion was largely on his side. Instead of pelting him with refuse, the crowds reportedly threw flowers and drank to his health. It's a great example of how the intended shaming effect of the pillory could sometimes be subverted if the criminal had popular support, and it highlights the active role the audience played in these public punishments. Beyond these iconic devices, other common forms of public penance and discomfort abounded. We've mentioned flogging before, and while it could be a severe punishment in itself, a whipping at a public whipping post was a common sight for various offenses. Many towns had a post specifically for this purpose, often near the stocks or pillory, creating a little hub of local justice. Then there was the drunkard's cloak, sometimes known as the Newcastle barrel, or the Spanish mantle. This was literally a heavy wooden barrel with holes cut for the arms and head that a person convicted of public drunkenness might be forced to wear and parade through the streets. It was cumbersome, uncomfortable, and utterly ridiculous looking, ensuring maximum shame. If you were caught being a public nuisance by being too drunk, your punishment might involve becoming an even more public nuisance by waddling around, encased in oak, looking like a misplaced piece of pub furniture. Irony medieval style. Public penance often had strong religious overtones. You might be ordered by an ecclesiastical court, or even a secular one, for moral offenses to stand or kneel outside the church door during services, perhaps barefoot, and clad only in a simple white sheet symbolizing penitence holding a lit candle. You might have to publicly confess your sins to the congregation. This was less about intense physical pain and more about profound spiritual and social humiliation, a public acknowledgement of your wrongdoing before both God and your community. A quirky and less widely known instrument of public restraint and shame was the jugs, also spelled jugs or juggies. This was an iron collar with a chain which was attached to a wall, a church door, the market cross, or a dedicated post. The offender's neck would be locked into the collar, leaving them chained up for a set period, again exposed to public view and ridicule. It was simpler than the stocks or pillory, but equally effective in immobilizing and shaming. Imagine being literally tethered to the fabric of your community, unable to escape its collective gaze, your discomfort, a public spectacle. These common cruelties served a vital function in maintaining day-to-day social order. They were visible, immediate, and relatively inexpensive to administer. They reinforced behavioral norms for a wide range of minor transgressions that, while not threatening the foundations of the state, could disrupt the peace and harmony of a local community. Historians still debate the actual frequency of these common punishments compared to the more severe judicial mutilations or executions we've discussed. Did their very commonness, the fact that you might walk past someone in the stocks on your way to buy bread, truly desensitize the populace to suffering? Or did each instance, however familiar, the sight still serve as a potent, if routine, reminder of authority and the consequences of stepping out of line, even in small ways? It's likely a bit of both, a constant, low-level background hum of punitive threat that underscored daily life in the medieval period. So you've perhaps endured the public humiliation of the stocks, your ankles aching, and your dignity peppered with rotten cabbage. Maybe you've even worn the infamous drunkard's cloak and felt the full weight of community disapproval, a walking, talking barrel of regret. These, as we've seen, were the more everyday reminders to keep you on the straight and narrow path of medieval conformity. But what happened when the crime was so grave, so shocking to the medieval sensibility? Treason that threatened the king, heresy that endangered souls, murder that tore the fabric of the community, that no amount of public shaming, no temporary physical pain, no loss of a limb was deemed a sufficient price. Then, my friend, you faced the ultimate sanction, the capital consequence, where death was the intended and often agonizingly drawn-out outcome. Their legal system really believed in go big or go home, especially when it came to this final terrifying act. The death penalty was, by our standards, alarmingly common in the medieval period. This wasn't just because life was generally cheaper, as we discussed way back in our early wanderings. It was also because long-term imprisonment as a primary punitive measure simply wasn't a developed concept or a practical option for most communities. Jails were often just holding pens. So for serious offenses, execution served multiple purposes. It was the ultimate retribution, a stark and supposedly effective deterrent, and quite pragmatically, it permanently removed the individual deemed a threat to society. When you couldn't afford to feed and guard someone for decades, and when the idea of rehabilitation was, shall we say, not high on the agenda, a final public ending was often seen as the most straightforward solution. The methods employed were, to put it mildly, varied and often disturbingly creative, each carrying its own symbolic weight and level of calculated suffering. Hanging was perhaps the most widespread method, being relatively simple to carry out. You'd be taken to the gallows, a permanent fixture in many towns, or at prominent crossroads, the famous Tyburn tree in London. A mainstream historical fact was a massive triangular gallows where multiple hangings could and often did occur simultaneously, a grim spectacle for the assembled crowds. Death by hanging in this era was often a slow process of strangulation, not the quick neck snapping sometimes achieved with a long drop. For crimes like treason, as we've touched upon, it could be just one part of a more elaborate ritual, like being hanged, drawn, and quartered, a truly horrific sequence designed to maximize suffering and public horror. Beheading, typically with an axe or a sword, was often considered a more honorable death, sometimes reserved for those of noble birth. It suggested a quicker, cleaner end, though its actual swiftness depended heavily on the skill and sobriety of the executioner. A bungled beheading requiring multiple blows was a dreadful prospect for the condemned, and a source of agitation or even anger from the crowd who expected a certain grim professionalism. For offenses deemed to be against God, particularly heresy, or in later centuries, witchcraft burning at the stake was a common and terrifying fate. The symbolism was potent fire, was seen as a purifying element, capable of cleansing the pollution of heretical beliefs from the community and the soul of the condemned. Though whether the person being slowly consumed by flames appreciated this spiritual dimension is highly debatable. The process was deliberately slow, a prolonged public agony intended to serve as a terrifying warning against straying from accepted religious doctrine. Drowning was another method sometimes prescribed for women, as it was considered less bloody and therefore somehow less unseemly for female offenders in certain cultures. This wasn't always a simple submersion. A truly bizarre and quirky tidbit with roots in ancient Roman law, but which saw revivals or echoes in parts of medieval Europe, was the poena culae, or punishment of the sack. This was reserved for the crime of parricide, killing one's own parent or close relative. The condemned person would be sewn into a leather sack, not alone, but with a bizarre collection of live animals, typically a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. This unhappy writhing menagerie was then cast into a river or the sea. One can only imagine the sheer terror and the symbolic horror of this. Someone clearly had a very specific and rather theatrical grudge against parricides, and possibly also against monkeys who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time. For crimes like coining, counterfeiting money seen as an attack on the sovereign's authority, or sometimes poisoning, the horrifying punishment of boiling alive was used in some regions, notably in parts of England and continental Europe. The condemned would be lowered sometimes slowly into a large cauldron filled with boiling water oil or even wine. The public nature of this, the sight of the massive pot, and the waiting fire, the agonizingly slow death. It was designed to instill maximum terror. Then there was breaking on the wheel, a particularly brutal method. You would be tied spread-eagled to a large cartwheel, and your limbs would then be systematically broken with an iron bar or a heavy cudgel. After this, you might be left on the wheel, raised on a pole to die slowly from your injuries, shock, and exposure, a gruesome spectacle for all to see. You knew it was a truly serious offense when the punishment involved more than just a sternly worded letter and a trip to the stocks. Like, say, being intimately introduced to the wheel and its associated iron bar. It's also worth mentioning peine forte et dure, strong and hard punishment. This wasn't technically an execution method, but a form of coercion used in English common law when an accused person refused to enter a plea of guilty or not guilty to a felony. To refuse a plea was to stall the trial. So you'd be laid on your back, and heavy stones would be progressively piled onto your chest until you either entered a plea or, as often happened, died from the crushing weight. If you died without pleading, you technically hadn't been convicted, which could sometimes mean your property wouldn't be forfeited to the crown, a small, grim consolation for your heirs. The ritual surrounding these executions was almost as important as the death itself, as we explored in Section 5. The solemn procession from the jail, the possible stop at a church for last rites, the condemned person's final speech from the scaffold, the presence of clergy, the executioner in his often distinctive attire, and the reactions of the crowd, all were integral parts of this public theater of death. Choosing your method of departure wasn't usually on the options list for the condemned, but the variety on offer from the authorities was alarmingly creative. Historians still debate the true impact of these extreme displays. Did the overwhelming theatricality and calculated brutality of public executions primarily serve as an effective deterrent, scaring the populace into obedience, or did it also risk at times desensitizing people to violence, or even provoking unintended reactions like sympathy for the condemned, or a morbid fascination that overshadowed the intended moral lesson, perhaps even subtly undermining the state's authority if an execution was perceived as unjust or excessively cruel? It's a complex question, reflecting the equally complex and often contradictory nature of medieval society's relationship with life, death, and justice. So we've navigated the rather grim and often theatrical hit parade of capital punishments, those ultimate consequences designed to ensure you wouldn't be troubling the authorities or indeed anyone else ever again. But as you drift deeper into this shadowy past, it's important to remember that medieval justice, much like medieval fashion, or perhaps even their attempts at dental hygiene, wasn't a one-size-fits-all affair across the entirety of Europe. Just as different regions had their own distinct dialects, their favorite local saints, and their own peculiar methods for brewing ale that might either delight your palate or send you running for the nearest, well, let's just say, facility. They also developed their own unique, sometimes deeply bizarre punitive customs. It seems getting creative with cruelty, or at least with finding distinctive ways to enforce social norms, was a bit of an inter-regional pastime. Every kingdom duchy, or even fiercely independent city-state, often wanted to put its own particular spin on making you regret your life choices. You see, the legal landscape of medieval Europe was a patchwork quilt. There was no overarching international law, no Geneva Convention for petty thieves or blasphemers. Royal decrees might attempt to impose some uniformity within a kingdom, but local traditions, ancient customs, and the whims of regional lords often held considerable sway. What might earn you a stern talking to, and a day in the stocks in one village could just a few days' journey away see you facing something far more inventive and unpleasant. Some medieval kingdoms, it sometimes feels, were in a subtle competition for the most memorable, if not always effective forms of punitive expression. Let's wander through a few examples. In parts of Scandinavia, the Old Norse legal traditions, while evolving, still cast a long shadow. Outlawry, for instance, was a particularly severe fate. Being declared an outlaw, a skogarmadur, or forest man in Old Norse, meant you were stripped of all legal protections, essentially becoming a social pariah whom anyone could kill without penalty. The process of declaring someone an outlaw at the Althing in Iceland, their ancient assembly, was a complex legal ritual in itself. While not a direct physical punishment inflicted by a state executioner, the social and psychological torment of being utterly cast out. A wolf's head, as they sometimes said, was a uniquely harsh sentence in those close-knit societies. Moving into the Germanic lands, we find influential law codes like the Saxon Spiegel, Saxon Mirror, a mainstream historical fact for you. Compiled in the 13th century, this was one of the most important German law books of the Middle Ages. It meticulously recorded existing Saxon laws and customs, and it didn't shy away from detailing some very specific and often quite literal punishments. The Saxon Spiegel is a treasure trove for understanding the legal mindset, including its continued emphasis on mirror punishments, making the punishment reflect the crime. For instance, someone who blinded another might be blinded themselves, or a thief might lose a hand. It laid out a whole hierarchy of offenses and their corresponding, often grim retributions, providing a kind of legal blueprint for parts of Central Europe. Over in the often bustling and fiercely independent Italian city-states like Florence or Venice, justice also had its local flavors. While feuds and vendettas between powerful families sometimes overshadowed formal legal processes, these cities also developed elaborate public shaming rituals. In some Italian towns, you might encounter the gabbia, or hanging cage. This was an iron cage in which a prisoner could be suspended, often high up on a public building or tower exposed to the elements and public ridicule for days, weeks, or even longer. Sometimes this exposure itself led to death from thirst hunger or harsh weather, making it a slow and very public execution. Imagine being trapped in a metal cage, dangling above the bustling piazza. Every market day, a fresh wave of faces staring up at your misery. France, too, had its regional variations. While the power of the French kings gradually centralized local customs known as coutumes persisted for a long time. The way royal edicts were interpreted and applied could differ significantly from one duchy or county to another. Forms of charivari, or rough music, that communal shaming ritual we touched upon in Section 8, could take on particularly elaborate or notorious forms in certain French regions, often targeting adulterers or those who violated community marital norms with a cacophony of noise and public mockery. You thought your local homeowners association had some picky and rather intrusive rules. Imagine living somewhere where a domestic squabble, if it became public knowledge, could lead to an entire evening of your neighbors serenading you with banging pots, effigies, and possibly a donkey wearing a hat, all to express their collective disapproval. Down in the Iberian Peninsula, the lands that would become Spain and Portugal had their own complex legal history, influenced by Roman law, Visigothic codes, and later the long centuries of the Reconquista. Here particularly, as Christian kingdoms expanded, punishments often took on a strong religious dimension, especially concerning offenses between different religious groups or those perceived as challenging religious orthodoxy. The emphasis on religious conformity could lead to specific penalties for blasphemy, apostasy, or interreligious transgressions, reflecting the unique historical and cultural context of the region. One particularly quirky and environmentally specific tidbit comes from medieval Frisia, a coastal region along the North Sea in what is now the Netherlands and Germany. Given their constant battle against the sea dikes, were and still are crucial for their survival. Consequently, damaging a dike, whether intentionally or through gross negligence, was an incredibly serious offense. One recorded punishment, almost too grimly poetic, involved the culprit being taken to the breach in the dike. they might then be staked down, or even, according to some accounts, forced to try and plug the hole with their own body as the tide came in. It's a chilling example of a punishment directly and terrifyingly linked to the specific existential threat of that community. There's no ambiguity in that message: you threatened our collective survival, so you will personally confront the consequence. Of course, the existence of these detailed regional law codes and documented unique punishments doesn't always tell the full story. Historians still debate how consistently these codified regional laws, like the Sachsenspiegel or various Scandinavian codes, were actually applied in practice at the most local level. To what extent did unwritten local customs, the personal discretion of a local lord or village council, or simply the practicalities of a given situation override the official legal texts? Justice on the ground could often be a far messier and more negotiated affair than the neat paragraphs in a law book might suggest. But the sheer variety of these regional quirks and cruelties underscores a key point. The medieval world was far from uniform, and its approach to justice was as diverse and at times as bizarre as the people and cultures that inhabited it. So we've journeyed through the rather alarming regional variations of medieval justice, discovering that while the overarching theme might have been, "Don't upset the established order unless you're fond of extreme discomfort," the specific ways this message was delivered could differ quite dramatically from one kingdom or even one valley to the next. But now let's pan out a bit and consider the dimension of time. We're talking about the medieval period, a vast swathe of history stretching roughly from the 5th to the 15th century. That's 1,000 years, give or take, a few decades for arguing historians. Did these brutal methods, this reliance on public pain and shame, change significantly over those many centuries? Did things perhaps get a little less bizarre, a little less brutal as time wore on? Or was it more a case of old cruelties getting a new coat of paint, or perhaps even some extra pointier accessories? The medieval period wasn't exactly known for its rapid adoption of kinder, gentler approaches to, well, much of anything, least of all criminal justice. It's crucial to remember that change, when it did occur, was rarely linear or uniform. Think of it less like a steady march towards enlightenment and more like a meandering, often muddy path with plenty of detours and the occasional backtrack into a particularly thorny thicket. The early Middle Ages, roughly from the fall of Rome to around the year 1000, had a different flavor of justice compared to the High or Late Middle Ages. In those earlier centuries, with centralized state power, often weaker justice frequently relied more on local customs, community involvement, and systems like vergild, that man price, where compensation, often in goods or silver, was paid to the victim or their family to settle feuds and avoid escalating violence. Ordeals, as we explored back in Section 7, were a prominent feature, a way of calling on divine intervention when human proof was lacking. Punishments could certainly be brutal and immediate, but the elaborate, theatrical, state-sponsored spectacles of agony were perhaps less common than they would become later, with more emphasis on restoring a local balance, however roughly. As you move into the High Middle Ages, say, from around 1000 to 1300, you start to see significant shifts. Royal power began to consolidate in many parts of Europe. Kings and emperors worked to centralize justice, creating more formal court systems and attempting to standardize laws. A mainstream historical fact from this period is the Assize of Clarendon in 1166 in England, issued by King Henry II. This was a series of ordinances that significantly reformed the administration of criminal justice, strengthening royal courts, introducing early forms of jury inquest to accuse not yet to try facts, and generally aiming to bring more offenses under royal jurisdiction rather than leaving them to local lords or private vengeance. This centralization didn't necessarily mean softer justice. Royal power often expressed itself through stern visible punishment, but it did mean a move towards more formalized procedures. This was also the era, as we noted, when the Church began to withdraw its sanction from ordeals, prompting the development of other methods of proof. Then you arrive in the late Middle Ages, from about 1300 to 1500. This was a period of immense upheaval, devastating plagues like the Black Death, prolonged conflicts like the 100 Years' War, peasant revolts, and significant social and economic stress. How did this impact punishment? In some ways, it seems the anxieties of the age may have led to an intensification of punitive measures. When the social fabric feels like it's fraying, authorities often react by cracking down harder to maintain control. Theatricality in punishments. Those grand public spectacles of suffering we've discussed may have become even more pronounced as states sought to assert their authority in turbulent times. You'd think, after a few centuries of inventive cruelty, someone might pipe up in a town meeting and suggest a focus group on less agonizing alternatives. But that particular suggestion box apparently remained largely empty. Progress, if you could call it that, was agonizingly slow. It wasn't like one Tuesday they were all about dunking people in ponds to see if they floated, and by Friday they were pioneering restorative justice circles with herbal tea and shared feelings. The role of the Church in this evolution was also complex. While it sometimes acted as a moderating influence, advocating for ideas like the peace of God and truce of God to limit feudal violence, and running its own ecclesiastical courts, which generally avoided the death penalty, it also had its own mechanisms for dealing with perceived spiritual deviance. The Inquisition, for example, established to combat heresy, used its own procedures, including psychological pressure, and at times condoning the use of torture by secular authorities to extract confessions. The treatment of heretics, often culminating in burning at the stake, remained a stark feature, particularly as religious anxieties heightened in different periods. A quirky tidbit that illustrates the elaborate ritualism that could develop especially towards the end of the medieval period and into the early modern is the auto da fe, meaning act of faith, most famously associated with the Spanish Inquisition. These were grand public ceremonies where sentences against heretics and other religious offenders were pronounced. Not everyone condemned in an auto da fe was executed. Some received lesser penances, wore distinguishing garments like the San Benito, or were reconciled to the Church. However, for those deemed unrepentant or relapsed, the auto da fe would be followed by their relaxation to the secular authorities for execution, usually burning. The ceremony itself was a long, highly orchestrated public spectacle involving processions, sermons, and the solemn reading of sentences designed to be an imposing display of religious and state power and a lesson to all onlookers. So did punishments become less brutal over the medieval centuries? It's very hard to say definitively yes. While ordeals largely faded and legal procedures became more formalized in some areas, the punishments themselves, mutilation, horrific executions, intense public shaming, remained staples of the judicial diet. Some argue that the efficiency and visibility of state-sponsored brutality might have even increased in the later Middle Ages as administrative capabilities grew. This leads to an ongoing discussion among scholars. Historians still debate whether the apparent increase in the recorded severity and theatricality of punishments in the late Middle Ages reflects an actual rise in brutality, or if it's an artifact of better record keeping and a growing state apparatus more capable of staging and documenting such events. In other words, were there more gruesome punishments, or do we just have more surviving paperwork and chronicles describing them in lurid detail? What is clear is that the fundamental belief in the necessity of pain, shame, and public spectacle as tools of justice remained deeply entrenched throughout the medieval period. The idea of rehabilitation of punishment, aimed at reforming the offender into a productive member of society, was largely absent. Justice was about retribution, deterrence, and the dramatic affirmation of authority, both divine and secular. The methods might have shifted subtly in emphasis or regional flavor, but the underlying grimness was a remarkably persistent feature of the medieval landscape. So after centuries of what often seems like an unbroken reign of judicial terror, where ingenuity in devising new ways to inflict pain and public shame appeared to be a primary form of legal innovation, you might be finding yourself, as you drift along in this historical haze, wondering if anyone, anywhere ever paused, looked at a person about to be boiled or broken on a wheel, and thought, chaps, perhaps there's a slightly less agonizing way to go about this whole justice thing. Well, as the long medieval period began to slowly, almost imperceptibly bleed into what historians call the Renaissance and the early modern era, the very first, tiniest, almost microscopic seeds of change did indeed begin to sprout. It wasn't like there was a sudden medieval be kind to criminals movement, complete with awareness ribbons, but a few brave, or perhaps just pragmatic voices started to tentatively question the relentless cycle of extreme public brutality. This wasn't a revolution in thinking, not by a long shot. The 16th and 17th centuries would still witness appalling levels of judicial violence, including widespread witch hunts and brutal punishments during religious conflicts. But somewhere in the intellectual ferment of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, new ideas began to stir. The Renaissance saw a renewed interest in classical learning in Greek and Roman texts that sometimes offered different perspectives on society, law, and human nature. This movement, known as humanism, began to place a greater emphasis on human reason, human dignity, and the potential for human improvement. While most early humanists weren't radical penal reformers, their work started to create an intellectual atmosphere where unquestioned traditions, including those surrounding punishment, could at least be examined. A key mainstream historical fact here is the work of Sir Thomas More, an English lawyer, statesman, and humanist. His famous book, Utopia, published in Latin in 1516, just nudging the conventional end of the medieval period, but his ideas were certainly brewing in those final medieval decades, offered a fictional portrayal of an ideal society. Within this framework, More critiques many aspects of contemporary European life, including the harshness of criminal law. He famously questions the wisdom and morality of executing people for theft, arguing that such a severe punishment for a crime, often driven by poverty and desperation, was both cruel and ineffective. His utopians, by contrast, punished theft with hard labor and restitution, seeking to make offenders useful to society rather than simply eliminating them. This was a radical thought for its time, suggesting that social conditions contributed to crime and that punishment should aim for something other than mere brutal retribution. Of course, More was writing about an imaginary island, and his ideas didn't exactly lead to an immediate overhaul of the English legal system. But the very act of publishing such a critique, and it being read and discussed by influential people, represented a small crack in the edifice of unquestioned punitive tradition. Other thinkers, too, began to ponder the purpose of law and punishment, sometimes subtly suggesting that excessive cruelty might be counterproductive, fostering resentment rather than respect for the law. Alongside these philosophical stirrings, there were slow, almost glacial developments in legal procedures in some parts of Europe. The gradual professionalization of law, with the rise of university-trained lawyers and judges, sometimes led to a more systematic, if not necessarily more lenient, approach to justice. There was a growing, though still very inconsistent, emphasis on gathering evidence and following established procedures, a slow drift away from the more arbitrary or passion-driven justice of earlier times. This didn't mean an end to bizarre or brutal punishments, but it perhaps hinted at a future where legal decisions might be based more on reasoned argument and less on the perceived need for immediate spectacular vengeance. Were there also shifting sensibilities among the general populace? This is much harder to gauge. As we've seen, crowds often flock to public executions and seem to revel in shaming rituals. Yet there were also instances like Daniel Defoe, in the pillory being showered with flowers, a story from a bit later in the early 18th century, but illustrative of a potential for public sympathy that likely had earlier less documented roots, which suggest that public reaction wasn't always one of uniform bloodlust. Perhaps the sheer relentless repetition of public brutality began to, in some minds, lose its terrifying impact, or even breed a certain weariness or quiet disapproval, especially if the punishment seemed disproportionate to the crime. The suggestion box for humane punishment alternatives probably still just had a dusty old tumbleweed in it, but maybe, just maybe, someone at least thought about building the box. A quirky and very early institutional development that hints at a nascent shift in thinking, though still a long way from humane reform, was the emergence of houses of correction, or early workhouses. For example, Bridewell Palace in London was granted to the city in 1553, again just tipping into the early modern, to be a place for punishing disorderly poor and vagrants, and for housing homeless children. The idea was to correct idleness and minor offending through compulsory labor and discipline. Now these places were often grim, harsh, and disease-ridden, and the labor was punishing. But they represented a departure from simply branding, mutilating, or executing people for vagrancy or petty offenses. There was an embryonic idea here, however flawed and cruelly implemented, that behavior might be changed, or at least managed through a structured regime, rather than just through immediate physical torment or death. It was a very, very early ancestor of the concept of a penitentiary, focused more on forced work than penitence, but still a deviation from the purely punitive model. It's crucial to reiterate that these were just faint whispers of change, not a chorus. The prevailing belief remained that harsh public punishment was essential, but these early questionings, these nascent institutional experiments, laid some of the very distant groundwork for later, more significant reforms that would take centuries to unfold. Historians still debate the primary drivers behind these initial shifts. Historians still debate whether the early humanist critiques of judicial cruelty stemmed more from a genuine shift in moral sensibility, a burgeoning empathy perhaps, or from pragmatic concerns about social order and the perceived ineffectiveness of overly brutal punishments in deterring crime when they became too commonplace or too extreme? Were people starting to feel that maybe, just maybe, watching someone get disemboweled wasn't the best form of civic education? Or were they simply noticing that despite centuries of inventive torments, crime stubbornly persisted, suggesting that perhaps fear alone wasn't the perfect solution? Whatever the primary motivation, these first few hesitant steps away from unquestioned brutality mark an important, if almost invisible, turning point. The shadow of the executioner's axe and the branding iron still loomed very large indeed, but somewhere in the intellectual and social landscape, a few tiny seeds were being sown, seeds that would over many, many more generations very slowly begin to grow into a different understanding of justice. And so, as we emerge from the shadowy depths of the late medieval world, where those first faint glimmers of doubt about relentless brutality were only just beginning to pierce the gloom, you might find yourself looking at our own era and wondering, after such a long and often gruesome journey through the landscape of bizarre and brutal punishments, do any of those ancient practices, those medieval mindsets, still cast a faint shadow on today's systems of justice? It's a long, winding road from the ordeal by hot iron to a modern courtroom, a path shaped by Enlightenment thinkers like Cesare Beccaria, who argued for rational and humane punishment, and by centuries of penal reform movements that are far beyond our sleepy scope tonight. But if you look closely through the haze of time, you might just discern some subtle and occasionally not so subtle echoes. Thankfully, our modern courthouses rarely feature a ye olde gibbet conveniently located out front for lunchtime spectacles. But the underlying human impulses towards retribution and societal control haven't entirely vanished. They've just changed their attire. Consider the powerful medieval emphasis on public shame, a tool we saw wielded through stocks, pillories, and humiliating parades. While we've mostly traded those physical implements for digital ones, the urge to publicly condemn and ostracize perceived wrongdoers is alive and well. Think of the modern phenomenon of cancel culture or online shaming. A misstep, a controversial statement, or an alleged offense can lead to a swift and widespread public denunciation via social media, a kind of digital charivari, where the angry crowd, instead of wielding pots and pans, wields keyboards and hashtags. The aim often is to damage reputations and enforce social norms, a ghostly echo of those earlier community-shaming rituals. Even the more formal justice system isn't entirely immune. The perp walk, where an accused person is paraded before media cameras, or the public dissemination of mugshots, can feel like modern, somewhat sanitized versions of being put on display for public judgment and scorn. The fundamental medieval drivers of punishment, deterrence, and retribution also resonate strongly in contemporary debates. While we now have complex theories of criminology and a stated aim of rehabilitation within many prison systems, public discourse often still gravitates towards the idea that punishment should make an example of offenders to scare others' deterrence, and that those who commit crimes simply deserve to suffer retribution. Concepts like three strikes laws or mandatory minimum sentences often carry a strong retributive undercurrent, and the desire to see justice be tough can sometimes overshadow more nuanced approaches. The spectacle of high-profile trials, endlessly dissected by media commentators and followed avidly by the public, isn't entirely dissimilar to the way medieval communities gathered to witness the drama of public justice unfold, though hopefully with less throwing of rotten produce at the defendant. Even some of our legal language and concepts carry faint medieval fingerprints. The idea of an outlaw, someone beyond the protection of the law, still has a certain resonance. The hue and cry, that communal obligation to pursue a fleeing felon, finds a distant echo in modern concepts of citizen's arrest or the importance of community policing and witness cooperation. The solemnity of taking an oath in court swearing to tell the truth, so help me God, in many traditions, harks back to that profound medieval belief in the sanctity of oaths, where God was considered a direct party to the proceedings. And the crime of perjury remains a serious offense, a recognition that the integrity of sworn testimony is vital to the functioning of justice, just as it was centuries ago. Our modern prison system, with its emphasis on long-term incarceration as a primary form of punishment, is largely a product of the 18th and 19th centuries. Medieval prisons, as we've hinted and will explore, if you tune in for another night's ramble, were typically just holding places. Yet the fundamental idea of isolating individuals deemed dangerous or undesirable from the broader community, of confining them and stripping them of their freedom, certainly has roots that go deep into the past. The very architecture of older prisons, with their emphasis on security and control, can sometimes feel like a more organized, if still grim, descendant of the medieval dungeon. And of course, the debate over capital punishment in those modern jurisdictions that still retain it is perhaps the most direct and most contentious link to these older forms of ultimate sanction. While the methods have generally, though not always, perfectly evolved away from the overt theatrical cruelty of boiling, burning, or breaking on the wheel, the state's assertion of its right to take a life as punishment for certain crimes is a practice with a very long and very medieval pedigree. Even the way we mark offenders today can be seen as a more technologically advanced, less physically scarring version of medieval branding. Criminal records, publicly accessible sex offender, registries the lifelong stigma that can attach to a conviction. These are all ways in which society continues to label and to some extent ostracize those who have transgressed, creating a kind of civic disability. A key turning point, a conscious effort to break from that past, is enshrined in the Eighth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution ratified in 1791, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishments. This was a direct response to the kinds of brutal and often arbitrary penalties that were commonplace in the preceding centuries, many of which had their origins or counterparts in the medieval era. For a quirky, subtle echo, consider the persistence of specific judicial attire in some legal traditions. The robes worn by judges, the wigs still donned by barristers in countries like the United Kingdom. While often explained by tradition, or the desire to convey impartiality and anonymity, this distinctive costuming also serves to elevate the proceedings, to create a sense of solemn ritual and authority, not entirely unlike the way medieval courts sought to underscore their power and the gravity of their judgments through ceremony and the distinct roles of their participants. While your local judge probably won't consult a bubbling cauldron or a heated iron for a verdict, the weight of legal tradition is still quite often a pretty heavy robe to wear. This connection between past and present often sparks discussion. Legal scholars and sociologists continue to debate whether the modern emphasis on incarceration, while less overtly violent than medieval corporal punishments, constitutes its own form of social death or civil disability that echoes the ostracization inherent in older shaming practices. When an individual is removed from society for decades, loses many civil rights, and faces immense barriers to reintegration upon release. How different is that in its long-term impact from being declared an outlaw or being permanently marked by a branding iron. It's a sobering thought to consider as we reflect on how far we've truly come. And so, our long, winding journey through the often unsettling and deeply shadowed landscape of medieval punishments, with all their bizarre rituals and brutal realities, finally draws to a close for tonight. The flickering torchlight that illuminated those ancient scenes of justice, both divine and all too human, begins to dim in our minds, now replaced by the softer, more familiar glow of your own quiet space. We've wandered through a world where life itself was a fragile commodity, where fear was a constant companion, and where the lines between sin and crime, between God's law and man's, were often blurred beyond recognition. We've seen how the community itself became the enforcer, how shame could be a weapon as potent as any blade, and how the human body could become a canvas for the terrifying artistry of retribution. We've witnessed the peculiar logic of ordeals, the grim theater of public executions, and the slow, almost imperceptible stirring of thoughts that would eventually lead to change. Though the echoes of those ancient practices may stretch ever so faintly, even into the fabric of our own time tonight, you can allow those images to recede, to soften at the edges. Let the weight of that historical exploration settle, and then let it drift away, like smoke from a long extinguished bonfire. The discomforts and dangers of that distant past are just that, distant. You are here now in the safety and comfort of your own surroundings. As you nestle deeper into your bed, feel the gentle support beneath you, the warmth of your blankets. Listen not for the clang of the jougs or the rumble of the crowd, but for the quiet, steady rhythm of your own breathing, the soft hum of the fan perhaps, or the peaceful silence of the night outside your window. Allow your mind to release the vivid details of our journey, retaining only the gentle cadence of my voice guiding you now towards a place of deep rest and tranquility. May your dreams be untroubled by iron collars or judgmental gazes, filled instead with peace, with calm, and with the gentle reassurance that you are secure. Drifting now, easily and peacefully, into a wonderfully restorative sleep. Sweet dreams.